We'll start with some intros. So for those of you who have not attended a webinar yet, my name is Estella Lugo. I'm the moderator for the CMT Connect webinar series. And I'm also the program development manager for the Hereditary Neuropathy Foundation. And our goal at H&F is to really, as patients ourselves, is to really connect our community with as many valuable resources as possible. So that's the goal with our CMT Connect series. And tonight we have a very special guest who's going to provide lots of value on the topic of accessibility in college for our young CMT students. And her name is Annie Tolkien. She is the CEO and founder of Accessible College. And she's going to be sharing a little bit about what as parents and students we need to know while we're exploring different colleges, where we're looking into it, what things we should be asking about, what things we should be asking for as far as accessibility goes, what we're entitled to, and yeah, that can really help our experience at college, because college is not easy to begin with. And so CMT obviously has its challenges, so we want to set everyone up for success. So Annie, yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe why and how you got started, and why you founded Accessible College.
Sure. Let me jump in. I'm actually going to share my screen, and I also wanted to encourage folks, like, if you have questions, comments, emergent thoughts during the presentation, feel free to type them in the chat box, and then we'll take some questions at the end. I will reserve plenty of time for interaction and questions, but if you have something that you want to ask, go ahead and type it in the chat and we will get to it at the end. So I'm super excited to be here with everybody this night, evening, afternoon, depending on where you're located. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and why I started my business, Accessible College. So I started Accessible College to provide college transition support and preparation for students with physical disabilities and health conditions and their families to help ensure a successful transition to higher education. And the reason that I did that is because colleges provide varying levels of accommodations and supports, which we will talk about. So at Accessible College, we work with a variety of students with different types of health conditions. So that could be things like POTS or lupus, cancer, autoimmune disorders, Crohn's disease, chronic fatigue. We also support students with physical disabilities. So that might be a student who uses a wheelchair or a mobility device. We also work with students with mental health conditions, because one of the things that healthcare providers and educators know is that oftentimes there is a comorbidity, a coexistence of mental health conditions when a student has a chronic health condition. We work with students with visual impairments and hearing impairments, also students who are deaf and blind. And like I mentioned before, the reason that I started this business was because there weren't really any other people doing this sort of support, specifically for students with physical disabilities and health conditions. So the services and supports that we provide help to bridge those gaps so that students and families can work effectively together to create positive educational experiences for students. Just a bit about me, I have over 10 years of experience in the disability field. Nearly 6 of those were spent as the Associate Director of the Academic Resource Center at Georgetown University, and that's Georgetown's Disability Support Office. Thing you should know, every college has a disability support office or a point person who's in charge of administering accommodations and working through the accommodations process with students. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. So when I was at Georgetown, I worked specifically with students with physical disabilities and health conditions. I also supported graduate, undergraduate, and medical students with the accommodations process, the housing accommodations process, and I provided academic support for the general student body on things like time management, managing their reading load, preparing for tests and things like that. One of the things that kind of prompted me to start this business was a lot of the students that I was working with at Georgetown weren't really sure about how the accommodations process in college worked. They weren't sure what types of accommodations they could request. They weren't really sure how to self-advocate or what that process looked like. One of the things that occurred to me was that there's such a big shift from high school to college in terms of the laws and the way that accommodations are administered. And so for students, that's a big shift as well. And so we need to be really preparing students early on to be able to self-advocate and to know what their needs are. A lot of the students that I was working with at Georgetown were really left unprepared for that transition to college. They weren't sure about what things they could ask for. And so through my business, I start working with students as early as 9th grade on these kind of preparation skills, self-advocacy skills, and things like that. And I want to contextualize this conversation for you all tonight, because I think there's some kind of misunderstanding about how many students with disabilities are on college campuses. And we actually have data to tell us that. So there's federal data that indicates that approximately 19% of undergraduate college students report having a disability. And what's important about that is these are the students who have gone to the Disability Support Office and gone through the process to request accommodations. And that number includes students with learning disabilities, with ADD, with mobility impairments, with mental health conditions or psychiatric conditions, and with health conditions. Sometimes, just as an FYI, visual impairments, hearing impairments get lumped in with mobility. Health conditions sometimes, like CMT, might have kind of a cross diagnosis, a mobility impact and a health condition impact. So there's some different category things that happen, but we know that 19% of students have gone through this process and requested accommodations in the college setting. We can assume that there's another portion of students on any given college campus that could request accommodations because they have a condition that limits their ability to be in school. And so we might think that there are probably, I don't know, another 19% of students who could request accommodations and either have not gone through the process or don't know that they can go through the process to request accommodations. Some of that could be stigma related, some of that could just be education related. But we do know that that makes students with disabilities one of the largest minority groups on any given college campus, just like people with disabilities are the largest minority group in the United States. Another fact that I have here is that approximately 7% of college students who report having a disability indicate that they have a physical disability or a mobility impairment. So we know that students with physical disabilities, mobility impairments, health conditions, and other types of disabilities are on college campuses. And so part of that too, part of the reason that that's important is because a lot of times students feel like they're the only one who is going through these things. And I often talk to students about the fact that the data does not support that, right? There are other students who have accommodations, who have needs. Part of this too is just sort of helping students understand that there are supports and there are groups, much like the group that we are here tonight, where students can get information and share ideas about what that college process has been like. There are other groups too, like the Health Advocacy Summit, which is a group of college students who has gotten together and is talking more about health conditions and their experience in college. There's another group called Dream Disability, which is part of the National Center for College Students with Disabilities. They have a group of self-advocacy, a network of self-advocates who can connect. So there are a lot of resources for students with disabilities who are in college that exist today. But in order to really understand why this is important and what we're talking about, we need to look at the laws. So first, there are a few laws that families, students should be aware of kind of going into this process. One is IDEA, that's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That's the law that governs special education supports and services for students with disabilities in the K through 12 setting. It provides for free and appropriate public education. So if your student had what is known as an IEP or an individualized education program or individualized education plan, it's because of that law. It's because of IDEA. IDEA does not apply to private schools, but Section 504 does, and that's the next one down there. So Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act prevents against discrimination on the basis of a disability. So your student might have what is known as a 504 plan, which outlines their accommodations. And that's something that is in both private and public schools. And it also applies to the college setting. But the most important law when a student with a disability is transitioning to college is the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that provides for reasonable accommodations in the college setting. And that's different from what students may have received in high school. A big difference in how this law kind of governs disability support is that students need to be able to engage in what is known as the interactive process and request their own accommodations. So in college, students are really the point person, and they're the ones who have to start the whole process to request accommodations. In high school, usually parents are connected and engaged and maybe advocating on behalf of their student, but that's not the case in college, which is a great segue to talking about the final law that I highlight here, which is FERPA, the Federal Educational Rights and Privacy Act. That's a law that typically surprises a lot of parents. It prevents the college from sharing information such as grades, class schedules, disciplinary actions, unless the student and the parent agree to sign what is known as a FERPA waiver. And that would give the parents access to the students' course records and things like that. So that's just something to keep in mind. I wanted to outline for you all just a real illustration of what the differences are between high school and college, kind of what that looks like when the rubber meets the road. So in high school, students with disabilities are usually identified by the school, and the teachers and the administrators know about the accommodations. They're outlined in a 504 plan or an IEP or in an academic plan. But like I mentioned, in college, students have to self-identify. So they have to disclose, they have to go to the disability support office, have a conversation, provide documentation, and then be able to follow up with each of their professors individually. In high school, the high school typically takes the lead in arranging all of the accommodations. So if the student, for example, gets extra time on a test, the high school knows and usually makes those arrangements. But in college, the primary responsibility for arranging accommodations falls on the student. So building off that example of extra time, if your student needs extra time on an exam, usually students have to go to the disability support office and request to take an exam in the disability support office in a testing center or in a testing environment there. That usually has to happen at least 3 to 7 days in advance of the exam. And for a lot of students, that's a level of planning and executive function skills that they maybe didn't have to have in high school. So that can be a big shift for students as well. And finally, the last example that I have here is that in high school, the teachers can usually identify if the student needs support. They can connect with the parents and share information. But in college, this is a big change. The student has to be proactive in seeking out support. So they have to know when something's not going right, and they have to feel comfortable reaching out to their professor, going to office hours, hiring tutors, maybe taking advantage of the services that are offered in the school. So that's a really big shift for a lot of students. And that's why starting to work with students pretty early on to develop those executive function skills, the organizational planning, calendars, and also to develop those self-advocacy skills is really, really critical. We also know that transition services really vary from high school to high school. So if your student has an IEP in high school, transition is usually a part of that conversation. But if they have a 504 plan, they usually don't receive any transition support or planning services. So for students who have health conditions like CMT and also have physical disabilities that maybe fall outside of the scope of what a typical high school counselor or a school learning specialist has managed. They need a more specialized kind of intentional approach, and they need more guidance and thinking through what are the things that they might need to live and be successful and independent on a college campus. So we talked a little bit about the process for requesting accommodations in college, which requires the student to connect with the Disability Support Office and disclose their disability. The student will have to provide documentation. The best thing for students and families to do if you're in like the college search process, start looking at the websites of the different schools that you're interested in, check out their disability support office. It might be called something else. It could be called accessibility services. It could be called student disability services. Usually, if you put in disability student in the Google search on the college's website, it'll take you to the disability support office webpage. And there you should be able to see their accommodations process and their documentation guidelines. Most schools have those things posted on their website. Those documentation guidelines could vary from school to school. There are some standards of practice, but there might be some variations in what they're requesting. So just to provide like a kind of a broad idea of what the typical types of documentation are, if your student has a learning disability, dyslexia, ADHD, usually most colleges would want to see a neuropsychological evaluation that has been completed in the last 3 to 5 years. If you have one that's out of that date range, you can always contact them and ask them if they would accept it. If the student has a mental health condition, they might also want to see a psychological evaluation or a letter from the healthcare provider. If your student has, a chronic illness or a physical disability, they'd likely want to see a letter from the healthcare provider that details, what the diagnosis is, how the student is being treated, and how the condition might impact them in the college setting. So I work with a lot of students and families to figure out what are the things that we need to detail out in that letter in terms of housing accommodations, which we'll talk on a little bit later, transportation, academic accommodations, because college is a little bit different from high school. If you're living on a college campus, that's different than just attending there during the day. Most of us don't consider the fact that students have a kind of controlled setting when they're living at home during high school. So a lot of things might be done for them. So we have to start thinking about what are the needs outside of the typical academic needs that a student might have. But most schools provide a template for doctors to fill out. So you can check the websites and see, and always contact these disability support offices ahead of time so you can make sure that you're submitting the right things. In terms of what I like to call supplementary documentation, these are documentation that are usually not accepted as primary documentation of a disability, as source documentation, but they're still good to hand in as documentation because they provide background and history for the people in the disability support office so that they can work with the student to figure out what the reasonable accommodations might be. And some of those things might be this copy of the student's IEP, a copy of the student's 504 plan. Maybe there's a letter from the high school that outlines any accommodations the student received, a letter that outlines the ACT or SAT accommodations. Those are all good for the students to just kind of have all together and be ready to submit those things. I usually tell students, like, start a Google Drive folder, start dropping these things in there so you have all your documentation in place, or put it on a flash drive, or go old school, print everything out, start a binder, so that you have some of these things already ready to go. So when you're doing your college search and you're starting that process, once you've been accepted, you've got everything in one place. You don't have to go back and try and find everything. I wanted to talk a little bit about examples of kind of typical accommodations and considerations. So I mentioned here that that sometimes students need to be thinking more about other types of accommodations that might be available to them. And those things can include, housing, which residential we have here, recreational, dining, and transportation. So let's talk through these things. So some typical academic accommodations that might be a consideration for someone with CMT. A student might need extra time on an exam. That could be, because of a medication they're taking. It could also be because of hand mobility, or maybe they need breaks during their exam. So those might be a carryover from what they received in high school. A laptop in class or a note taker, that's another type of accommodation that most colleges will offer students who have that need. What that looks like can be really different from school to school. And this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a variation in the types of accommodations that are offered. So you might think with a laptop in class, it's 2021, which schools, wouldn't allow a student to have a laptop in class? Well, some professors do not allow laptops in class. And so the only way that a student would be able to have a laptop in class is to go through the accommodations process to be able to have that laptop in class. So that could be a thing that your student might need to navigate. In terms of note takers, usually most colleges are doing a peer note taker where the professor will make an announcement and find another student, and that student will work with the disability support office to get the notes to the student who needs them. It's highly likely that there are several students who need notes in that class, because a lot of students feel like they're the only one who needs them. But again, 19% of college students receive accommodations on the basis of a disability. So if you're in a lecture hall with 100 students, it's likely that other students also need accommodations. They may also need a note taker. Flexible attendance. This is one that often comes up for students who have health conditions and that have flare-ups where they might not know how they're feeling any given day. That one is a little bit trickier. Students with CMT might request that accommodation, and it may be granted by the disability support office. It just depends on the student's documentation and what the school deems as reasonable. But the student will still have to connect with the professor and let the professor know and have a conversation about what it's going to look like in that class, because professors can say no to some accommodations like flexibility in attendance or extensions on assignments if they feel that it compromises the curricular goals of the course. And so the onus is on the student at that point to have these conversations with professors. And this can be really tricky for students who maybe don't have as much practice in having those conversations. So I work a lot with students on that. Oftentimes students may need to take a reduced course load. That might be an accommodation. It depends on the school and what the requirements are. So usually anything under 12 credits would be considered part-time. At some schools, you're not allowed to be an undergraduate student taking under 12 credits unless you have an accommodation. But that can also have an impact on your financial aid. So there's some other considerations there. Some students might want to use assistive technology like voice to text software, things like that. Some colleges provide those things, and some expect that students will come in with their own services, or their own assistive tech. So that's something you'd want to be talking to each of the disability support offices about in advance to make sure that you know what that school offers or does not offer in terms of support. And then I also put in here just another consideration or idea, and this is something that I often have students with physical disabilities ask for, which is classroom relocation, so that their classes can be in more accessible buildings, lower floors. It's something that a lot of students don't know that they can ask for, but we all know this. If you have a physical disability or you have a mobility impairment, things are not always accessible. And so we need to make sure that students are asking for what they need and what would be best for them. So you can ask for classroom relocation as an accommodation. The residential piece is kind of a key piece, especially if a student is going to be living on campus. So they might be thinking about a single room, and that could be for a variety of reasons. It could be for rest and recovery. It could be just to kind of manage things a little bit more systematically in a way that they're more comfortable with. Students could also request or might want to request fewer roommates. A lot of dorms now have like 5 or 6 people in a room, and maybe that wouldn't be ideal for your students. So thinking about fewer roommates, lower floor, that could be another type of accommodation that students want to ask, or a ground level floor. People don't often think about emergency evacuation. I do a lot. I think about emergency evacuation a lot. And I know that in colleges, having gone to college myself and then worked at a university, people burn pizzas at 3 a.m. and there are fire alarms that happen in residence halls. And so having an easy egress and easy way out can be really helpful. Students might be requesting an ADA accessible room. We all know that what is technically compliant might not be usable for the student, but it's important for students to know that if something isn't working for them, they can make a request. They can talk to the disability support office and see how can that be changed or what can be done about that. Students should really feel empowered to bring up these issues that they're having, especially if they're living on campus, because in a sense, it's their home. Personal care attendance. If the student maybe has a one-on-one aide in the high school setting, that's not something that colleges typically provide. A student would have to bring their own personal care attendant. So they'd either have to hire a personal care attendant to come with them, get one through an agency, or some students choose to work with higher number of students on campus to support them with daily living needs. So whether that's like dressing or showering or toileting or whatever the needs are, doing laundry, cleaning the room. So there are different ways to kind of navigate that, but that is an accommodation that a student would have to request. And the same thing goes over to like a lab setting or an academic setting. If a student needed support, they would have to request a personal care attendant or support to be allowed to come into the classroom. So that's a little bit different than the high school setting. Recreational, a lot of people don't think about this either, but any school that receives federal funding, which is most colleges, needs to be compliant and needs to have accessible fitness facilities. So students can request something if it's not there. And it could be as simple as just moving things on the fitness floor. It might be a chairlift for the pool. So students can request those things. In terms of dining, there's a couple things here. I have special diet written down, but the other thing might be assistance or support in the dining hall. Every college is a little bit different in how their dining services work, but if a student, can't carry the tray, walk to the table all at the same time, and they need support, they can ask for support in the dining hall. If your student has a special diet, whether that's an allergy or gluten-free or diabetic diet, they can work with dining services. They all have an accommodations process where a student can request an accommodation in the dining hall too. Transportation, another area under discussed on college campuses. Some colleges provide transportation between classes for students with health conditions or physical disabilities where mobility or fatigue might be an issue. Other colleges have, bus systems that kind of go around to general areas on campus. And some colleges have none of those things. So depending on the size of the school, kind of what the students' needs are, those might be things that you want to be looking at when you're searching for colleges, when you're going through this process. So those are just some considerations. That's not a definitive list at all. I just wanted to kind of highlight some things that folks can be thinking about as they're kind of going through these processes. So how to be successful in this process. We want to be starting this planning process as early as possible. I often joke that if we could start this with students in elementary school, that they'd be much more successful. So what are those things that we want to be thinking about ahead of time? Some of that is planning and organizing and self-monitoring. Some of that might be around medication management. So working with students to make sure that they have a system in place so that they know how to manage their own medicine, how to call their doctors, healthcare appointments, A lot of the students I work with, mom and dad have kind of taken care of a lot of these things prior to them going away to college. And the handoff is kind of tricky. That transition to adult care is really hard for everyone. And adding on some, having a health condition can be really, really challenging. So making sure that the student knows who their doctors are, how to make an appointment, that they're feeling comfortable having conversations with healthcare providers and university administrators. When I work with students, we often create a script because students will have to go to that disability support office, have to articulate what accommodations they'd like to request, why they need them. And then once they get approved for that accommodation, they'll get an accommodation letter. And that might be a printed letter, or it could be an email that goes to their professors. That email will outline for their professors what accommodations they've been approved for. So the professor doesn't know what condition the student has. It just tells them the student needs a note taker, they get extra time, whatever those accommodations are. And then it's the student who has to have a conversation with the professor, each individual professor, every single semester about that class. So if your student has flare-ups in their condition, they want to be talking about that with the professor. Hey, I have unpredictable flare-ups. My intention is always to be in class, but there might be some times where I can't make it. How should I let you know? They should be asking those questions and having those conversations with professors up front. That can also lead to what is commonly known as self-advocacy fatigue, because students find themselves having to constantly advocate and re-advocate for what they need sometimes. And so a lot of the work that I do with students is trying to figure out how can we kind of create some canned emails and some canned structures so that we're not having to, rethink this every single time we're having this conversation. And it's also really important for students to have good structures in place with peers and with healthcare providers and maybe mental health providers, so that they're engaging in some self-care as well, because that's really critically important. So we also need to be thinking about how we're supporting students in developing independent living skills while they're living at home. So some of that might be around just thinking through, does the student know how to do laundry? Does the student know how to make a simple meal? Just sort of basic skills, life skills that are going to carry over for the student once they're out of college too. But I think like the biggest thing here is if there is an issue and the student is having trouble kind of doing those things or navigating those things, then we also need to be thinking about what support structures do we want to make sure that we have in place in college so that the student can live as independently as possible. That might be a personal care attendant. It might be outsourcing some of the laundry issues or cleaning things, especially if the student is dealing with mobility issues and fatigue. So there is some problem solving that's kind of involved in that process as well. So the students need to have these essential skills. They need to be able to talk about their disability, so that they're having that conversation and they're comfortable talking about what their needs are. So the more they can practice that, the better off they'll be, whether that's connecting with, their high school teachers to have these conversations, practicing the conversations with a counselor or a parent. They have to know their needs. So a lot of times with students, we'll sit down and look at, their entire day or their entire week, and with their parents too. And oftentimes for parents, I'm a parent myself, we don't realize how much of the stuff that we just do, it's just kind of like background work. A lot of times in my work with parents, we'll sit down and we'll actually write out, what are the things that you support your student in doing? Do you make their lunch every day? Do you help them get dressed? Do you lay out their clothes? What are those things? Do you pick them up? Do they know how to drive? Do they know how to take public transportation? Just working through those pieces, because there's so much that we do to just kind of keep our lives moving. We sometimes don't take the time to think, okay, what are the things that my student is going to need to be able to live independently? And how can I support them in learning some of those things now? So making that list, talking through that list. And then for students, I often prepare students and parents for the fact that things won't always go perfectly. We have good plans and good strategies, And we need to make sure that students have tools in their toolbox so that if something doesn't go the way that they expect it to go, that they know who to talk to and contact. If that's the disability support office, if that's the counseling center on campus, if it's their healthcare provider, so that they can kind of know exactly where to go and who to connect with to get their situation addressed or resolved. So I wanted to talk to you about just a little broad overview of what I do. So I work with students. I do physical disability college planning. So working with students on thinking through all of these pieces, questions they'll need to ask on college tours, the types of accommodations they have now and how that might translate to the college setting, thinking through the medication management pieces, the self-advocacy skills. I also work with students on executive function coaching, and I work with students once they're in college, kind of post-transition college coaching to talk through any of the challenges that they might be having then and helping them and supporting them and figuring out how to move forward. I right now have a project. Oh, let me go back a step. Hang on. Things are happening. Wait, okay. I clicked on my own links. I will go back. There we go. Got it. I have a project with the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation and students with paralysis. And paralysis is defined broadly. So it doesn't have to be a student with a spinal cord injury, can work with me through the Reeve Foundation for free for up to 3 sessions. And so I put in the information for the Reeve Foundation here in case there are students who have any form of paralysis and want this type of support. And I'm going to put some information too in the chat box just on the project so you can link right to that as well. So you can check that out. That might be something that some students here might want to take advantage of. It's for students across the age range. So if you're students in high school or if you're an adult who's thinking about going back to college or getting into a vocational training program, I can work with you as well. You have to go through the Reeve Foundation to be a part of that project. And then I also wanted to post my contact information. So you can find me on my website, accessiblecollege.com. I'm also on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And if you go to my website, you can sign up for my newsletter down at the bottom left of the website. You'll see a little input there where you can sign up. And I'll leave that up momentarily, and I'll put all of this information in the chat box as well. And I'm also going to drop in a transition guide that I wrote for the Reeve Foundation, a link to that so you guys can see that too. So I'll stop my share, but I'll put everything in the chat box so you can get it. And then we'll take your questions.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, the wheels were turning the whole time because I'm like revisiting my own personal college experience and all of the things that I should have had accommodations for that I didn't, that, like you said earlier, you don't know what you don't know. And I think that's one of the biggest parts of working with you and the work that you do, is that filling in those blanks, because there's so much uncertainty, obviously, for parents and students starting this new chapter in their lives. And there is an understanding that the child needs to be more independent and that they're going to be on their own. And there's a lot of things that can be, figured out together before. It doesn't have to be this like big question mark and like looming, thing going into college. It's also about the social aspect of it too. I think is so important, is that the self-advocacy and really empowering students to speak up is huge. It's a huge part of it. And then we had some questions coming in here from Lori.
Lori, that's a great question. I'll read it out. So the question is, if you are in a dorm at college and you disclose a disability, do they room you with another similar student with a disability? I'm guessing is kind of the rest of that. So the answer is not exactly. So usually when you go through the housing accommodation process, typically that's through the Disability Support Office. So it kind of depends on what your request is, right? So if the student is using a wheelchair or a mobility device, depending on the school, they may have to be in a single room just because of space issues. And usually you wouldn't put two students who have two large wheelchairs in the same room unless there's a huge room.
Right.
Just like as a space functionality issue. Usually most colleges, students who have housing accommodations are just mixed in with the regular student population. There's not like a special dorm or like a label on your door or anything like that. And I think that's a common like kind of question that people have is like, am I going to be isolated? And the answer is no. However, there are some schools, and one comes to mind, University of Florida, who they have a brand new like retrofitted dorm that has some rooms that are for people who use wheelchairs and need lifts. So they have like Hoyer lifts like in the ceilings of the dorm. So there are more students who use wheelchairs who live in that dorm, but not every student who uses a wheelchair lives in that dorm. And dorms are kind of like hotels in that a certain number of rooms have to be ADA compliant, and they're usually mixed in throughout the building. So I guess the answer to your question is like, if your student met another student and that other student used a wheelchair and they wanted to pursue living together, they could do that. I mean, if they chose to do that, but they don't have to live with another student with a disability. Sometimes students choose to live with other students with disabilities, whether they both, it might be someone with an invisible disability with someone with a visible disability or whatever, mix and match. But sometimes students find community in other people who have health conditions who can kind of understand, what they're going through. So sometimes that happens. But if your student wanted to go through the regular housing selection process, they could still do that. It all has to be a conversation with the Disability Support Office. And I see another thing here. Yeah. So Matt said that housing accommodations were key for his son on a big campus. Yeah, so that he could choose classes. Yeah, and different schools, he mentions Michigan, and Michigan's a big campus. State schools often have transportation support specifically for students with disabilities, in addition to some of the buses and things that they run. So some students choose to go to a large school because of that. Other students might choose to go to a super small school so that they can have a smaller community and less of a footprint to have to get around. So it really just depends on the student and kind of what they're looking for and what they want. I should also say too, it came up in my head and I forgot to take it out of my mouth. There are two colleges that have personal care attendant services built into their program. One of them is the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. So they have a PCA program where students who need a personal care attendant do live in a specific dorm. And the other one is Wright State in Ohio. There used to be more colleges that offered personal care attendant services, but those are the only two that are still around.
Okay. Yeah, we had an earlier question from Mary Beth asking about students. She said 30 years ago were able to assist with personal care, but they can no longer do that.
So I don't see her question. I don't see her question, but I do work with students who hire other students to assist them in with personal care. It just kind of depends on the student, on the campus, on all of those things. I have a student who I'm working with now who hired like a cadre of nursing students to support her during the day. She basically just needed just bathroom breaks throughout the day. So she hired 10 different students. She set up a schedule.
Wow.
And it's cheaper for her to do that way too. And for the nursing students, it gives them a resume builder, right? So that
Exactly.
they can actually say like, here's how I've supported, a student, and here's how that worked. So,
That's
um,
interesting. And how logistically, how would, I mean, is that the hiring process done through the school or is that done completely privately?
so
Or both?
usually, depends on the school, but
Okay.
some disability support offices will help students circulate an ad, but typically the onus is on the student and the family to figure out how that's all working. In that Reeve Foundation guide that I posted here, the Navigating College with Paralysis, there's actually a section on hiring a personal care attendant.
Okay.
And I'm also going to post, United Spinal has a great guide. I'm posting it now. It's the Wheels on Campus guide. It has the 20 most wheelchair friendly campuses. And it also has kind of student experiences at these different schools. So it's really from a student narrative.
Mm,
Um, and it has lots of great information that people might be just interested in general, in terms of like, what does accessibility look like on different college campuses in terms of physical accessibility. So yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think when we think about college, we think of like those big lecture halls with the steps, which is like super terrifying for people with CMT. So I was really interested in the request for a different classroom or classroom relocation. I didn't even think that was a possibility.
You can request, I mean, in a sense, it's like you can request anything,
Yeah.
right? They don't always have to approve it, and they might do it in different ways, right? So the classroom relocation piece, that might be mitigated if they're willing to offer a van to help you get from place to place, right? So you might not need that. Whereas some campuses, they might not have a van. So, relocating classes is a reasonable accommodation in that circumstance. Um, Someone else asked just about whether or not it was easier to get accommodations, or in my experience, is it easier to get accommodations at public or private schools?
Mm,
And that is a fantastic question. It's also a really tricky question, and here's why. You've seen one disability support office, you've seen one disability support office. There are similarities between them and public and private schools, but really, this is why it's super important for students to engage with the disability support offices prior to signing that dotted line, and going to that school, because you are a consumer, whether you're a parent or the student. Like, you're buying a product when you're going to college, and you want to make sure that the thing that you're buying into is actually going to work for you. So I always tell students to sit down with the people in the disability support offices. Most of them will give you 15 minutes or 30 minutes of their time and come up with some questions that you're asking them. You want to interview those people in
mm,
that office to make sure that they're a good fit for you. So you can do some of the research on the disability support office website, but connect with those people and see what, for other students who have similar conditions, what types of accommodations have they provided for those students? That's something you can ask. You can ask how many wheelchair users or mobility device users are on campus. You can ask to be connected to some of those students. So you can ask the disability support office, can you reach out to other students who have, X health condition, or use a wheelchair, or use a mobility device, and see if they'd be willing to talk to me as a prospective student. You want to see if those people are going to work with you and support you. And you can kind of get a sense of like what that vibe is, and use that to inform your process of whether or not you want to choose to go to that school.
yeah.
So I hope
I
that
think
helps.
testimonies from actual students are is super, powerful because you're probably going to get a much more honest, much more honest feedback from someone who's experiencing.
Yeah. And
Like,
I mean, I say this with love because I was on the other side of the desk in a disability support office, but every school is going to say that they are compliant, right? They're all going to say, I'm ADA compliant. We're ADA compliant. And once we review your students' documentation, once they're accepted and they've signed the line, we'll work with them to figure out what accommodations they will be approved for. And that's a nice answer, but it's not a helpful answer if you're trying to determine whether or not a school is going to be a good fit for you. So as a consumer, as a student, you need to be asking more probing questions to try and get better answers. And that's part of like what I do with students and families is figure out what are those questions that we need to be asking that are specific to your needs so that we can get the answers that are going to inform whether or not you want to attend that university.
Right. Yeah. And just, I mean, just having that point person that you can ask those questions to is as they come up, right? You're not going to have all the answers on the first day of classes, but just being empowered enough to know where to go to seek those accommodations and support is super important.
And Matt also mentioned priority early enrollment, which is also known as
Mhm.
priority registration. And that's a really helpful accommodation for students, especially if you have kind of medical needs or personal care needs in the morning or throughout the day, so that you can select classes prior to everybody else so that the classes that you choose are good with your schedule, whatever that schedule might be. So that is a accommodation that a number of students do request priority registration. So that could be another thing that students might want to consider.
Yeah. I think Mary Beth had some additional feedback regarding hiring a personal care assistant on campus. She said I guess in her experience, they prevent her from advertising, and it's been very frustrating with her daughter.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is something that really varies from school to school.
Mm.
Some of the students that I work with opt to use like Indeed, or they contact if the school has a nursing program or an occupational therapy program or physical therapy program. You can always contact the directors or deans of those schools with your ad to see if they'll send it out to their students. Sometimes schools will do that as well. But yeah, there are a lot of barriers, especially the cost of having a personal care attendant, which is a good plug or a good time to talk about too. Making sure that your student is registering in your state for vocational rehabilitation. Sometimes, depending on the state, and every state is different, and if you've had experiences with vocational rehabilitation, everybody's had some experience, might be positive, might be negative, but sometimes they offer funds or assistive technology support, or they'll pay for some part of that college education. So you want to make sure that process can often be arduous to get into the system and to get the things you need. So connecting with Voc Rehab in your state prior to starting college could be helpful, and it could be a source of funding for some of these pieces. So that's just something to be aware of. I think a lot of people don't realize that could be a resource to them for some of these things.
So do you also work with students who are already enrolled in college, maybe in their second or third year? I mean, I'm assuming it's harder to get those accommodations once you're already in the school, or not really.
So you can request accommodations at any time. So if the student has some accommodations and they want to work with someone on figuring out what else they could be requesting, yeah. So that's kind of the post-transition consulting that I do with students once they're in college, if they need help figuring out what they need. That is something that I work with students to figure out, because the other thing to remember is the ADA also applies to the workforce. So a lot of these accommodation pieces may be transferable to an internship or to the workplace setting eventually, right? So there's a component of that. So someone asked about VR Voc Rehab and whether or not they have to apply in their start with your state of residence. Start there. And different states have different policies around that too. So start with your state of residence and start the process there, and see where that leads you. Okay, I'm gonna go figure out, there's some more questions coming in. Found it helpful to figure out where the school goes PT. Oh, right. Okay. So that's a hot tip Matt just gave out. One of the things that was about physical therapy. One of the things that I do with students who get consistent PT, which are most of the students I work with who have physical disabilities are also going to PT. at least one time a week, probably more, probably should be doing more, like we should all be exercising more. But one of the things that we usually do is kind of map out, is there a hospital center on campus? Is there PT at that hospital center? What other PT options are available? Same with healthcare providers. If you have a specialist that you see and you need to, make sure that there is a specialist that has that area of specialty nearby. I work with students and families to figure out what are those criteria that we need to be considering in this college search process, and making sure that we're kind of mapping that out, because you might choose a school that's like an awesome fit all around, but is more rural or doesn't have as much access to specialist doctors and things like that. So the other side of that coin too is also like, yes, there might be PT nearby, but is it a PT place that's actually worked with people with CMT, or has an understanding of what that looks like. So that's another kind of piece of that puzzle. But once your student has determined where they're going to school, when they sign that dotted line on May 1st, that's when you want to start working on like looking into those healthcare providers and starting to make those inroads, because finding a doctor and getting into a new doctor can often be a really difficult process for people.
Absolutely. Yeah, and for those of you, we do have the HCP directory on the hnf-cure.org website. So there are some physical therapists on there as well, and there may be somebody nearby to college campus for you as well. Great. Any other questions? Or any last, David had some feedback here. He said he's so excited to hear this. There was nothing like this for students when I was in school in the late 70s and 80s. Yes, we've come a long way for sure. Still have a lot more work to do, but.
And I threw my website in case folks are interested. It's accessiblecollege.com. And it's funny that David mentioned that, because I'm still, as far as I know, the only person who focuses on transition for students with physical disabilities and health conditions. So there are a lot of, and sometimes like I'll work alongside high school counselors or college consultants. And I have like a whole group of college consultants who are now getting more well-versed in physical disability needs. But it is striking to me too, because there are so many students who need this information, and yet we are lacking in this information. So I am hoping to fill that gap. And if you check out my website, there's a ton of blog posts and things that might be helpful for you all. So yeah.
Yeah, Matt said every high school counselor needs to work with you. I agree.
I agree too.
Yeah, I mean, get more people talking early about this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I think your work is absolutely incredible, and I'm really grateful for you to donate your time and your expertise to our community. I encourage everyone watching to check out that opportunity to have some one-on-one sessions with Annie through the Relocation Foundation. Again, she posted the link in the chat there, so we will share that as well when we post this on YouTube. I think it's a great opportunity, and I think the key message here is to really encourage empowerment with our students, and just get them comfortable with, like you said, independent living as much as they can, they're capable of, and just giving them the permission to speak openly about their disability without worrying about judgment and discrimination and loss of opportunities, because it's what we want everyone to do well here, and we have a lot to offer to the world as far as professionalism and even going into nonprofit work and all of the things that we do to have a positive social impact on the world. So thank you.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me, and folks can reach out if they want to connect.
Awesome. Well, thank you. David said he's motivated and he's going to be contacting the schools.
Awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank
Spread
you,
the word.
everyone. Yes. If you have any questions, again, reach out to Annie or myself at info@hnf-cure.org, and stay tuned.